The class of 2000 is pleased to shine a spotlight on our pioneers. From our pioneers come inspiring stories demonstrating such noble characteristics as courage, faith, fortitude, and perseverance. They searched for truth in their lives, and by their own volition were compelled to find a place, their place. And what brought our ancestral pioneers to gather from all over the world? Well, some gathered for religion, some for the hopes of a better life, and some to escape hardship. But all came as pioneers. God put events and people into motion that with time and dedication prepared Short Creek, a safe haven, and a secluded frontier where the priesthood has asked us to gather to ask the Lord's blessing. And no other place has afforded such a long span of peace for the pure in heart to gather. So thank you for joining us as we examine pioneers past with pioneers present.
Horace Strong Rawson was born July 15, 1799, in Scipio, Oneida County, New York. He married Elizabeth Coffin, October 9, 1825, and settled in Randolph County, Indiana. Horace says, "Nothing very particular transpired in my childhood, only what is common until the War of 1812 with Great Britain. In 1813, the British came over Niagara River and burned Buffalo City and several other towns, and drove out the inhabitants to the frontiers. My father and his family with the rest, but they again returned. In 1819, my father and his family moved by water down the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh, then down the Ohio River to the falls, just below Cincinnati. We came very near being lost in a gale, but the Lord in His great mercy preserved us. My father and mother were goodly folk, reserved in all their ways. My father was a Baptist preacher. They lived up to the best light they had until their death. My father died in September 1824, in the 54th year of his age, leaving my mother with 6 children, and I, feeling some degree the obligation I was under to a kind and tender mother, done the best I could to relieve their wants. My mother died the following year in August. I married Elizabeth Coffin. She kindly assisted me in providing for my brothers and sisters until they could take care of themselves. We labored hand in hand and prospered much. We then moved to Randolph County, Indiana, and bought a quarter section of land and soon had a nice farm with suitable buildings and settled down to life as happy as we could be with the light we then had, steadily pursuing our labors, endeavoring to the best of our abilities to keep the first commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. In 1831, we were baptized by Levi W. Hancock and soon partook of the gathering spirit, being fully convinced that the Lord had set His hand the second time to gather His people in this, the 7th dispensation. In 1832, we moved to Jackson County, Missouri, the land of Zion, where I was ordained a teacher. We enjoyed ourselves well for a short time, filled with love toward each other, granting us the gifts, and we improved on them to a great extent. Then the devil got mad, you better believe, for we were a law-abiding people. He saw he couldn't harm us by the law. He therefore called out the mob, that being his only remedy, and fully commissioned them with his power. Then he went to Kirtland to attend to the prophet Joseph Smith, and the mob carried out his orders there. They then commenced their depredation by whipping some, tarring and feathering others, and unroofing and tearing down houses in the night, driving women and children into the woods, destroying property until we could stand it no longer. Therefore we came out in self-defense. Some skirmishes took place, some killed and some wounded on both sides, but we kept the ground until they gathered their forces, 3 to 1 of us, and they were well armed, and we were not. We met them on the temple lot and compromised, just on their terms, which was to give up our arms and forthwith leave the county. Our 2 oldest children traveled from Jackson County to Lafayette County barefooted. They were without shoes during the whole winter. I rented 4 acres of land from a Mr. Barnard, worked, paid for the use of it, and planted it. Prospects were fair for a good crop, but the mobs began howling and threatening, and I was advised by Thomas B. Marsh, who was then the president of 12 Apostles, to cross the Missouri River. I tried to sell the crop to Mr. Barnard, but he refused to give me anything, as he knew he would get it for nothing. In the spring of 1834, we were called to gather to Clay County, prior to the coming of the prophet Joseph Smith, with a portion of the strength of the Lord's house to redeem Zion. we were obedient to the call. The people here seemed very calm for a while, and then the mob began to gather on all sides, swearing that they would destroy Joseph and his band. They gathered in the night and got within a mile or two of the camp. The Lord interposed by sending his artillery from heaven in the form of an awful hailstorm, shearing some of their gun stocks to pieces and cutting through their caps into their skulls. Deflected in their purpose, they gladly left the field, carrying off their wounded. The Lord verified his promise, "I will fight your battles," and peace was restored again. Here, in 1836, I saw the prophet Joseph for the first time and heard him preach as I never heard a man preach before, speaking of the redemption of Zion and the restoration of scattered Israel, exhorting us to be faithful, and sealed up the church to eternal life, and then he returned to Kirtland. In the winter of 1837, we moved to the state of Illinois and settled in the city of Nauvoo, hoping to find more hospitable people, away from relentless hands of our persecutors. Here we enjoyed ourselves very well for some time, feasting on the teachings of the servants of God. Each time we moved, I found myself building another house and starting to plant and make a new start, always hoping to find security for my family. In 1841, I was ordained an elder under the hands of Charles Rich, and later ordained a high priest under the hand of Isaac Morley. I was also chosen one of the High Council and called to preside over the quorum of high priests of the branch, and was eyewitness to many of the recorded facts pertaining to the suffering of the saints. Although I wasn't present at the awful martyrdom of the prophet Joseph and Hiram, law-abiding holy men of God, cast into jail and murdered in cold blood. In the fall of 1845, we were driven from Nauvoo, our houses burned by the so-called Christians of Illinois. In the spring, we were obliged to go into the wilderness and seek a home among the red men of the desert. Daniel, my oldest son, was one of the boys called to the Mormon battalion, and we, by doing so, proved our loyalty to the government. In 1850, we moved to the Valley of the Mountains in the company of Wilford Woodruff and settled in Ogden City. I served on the High Council of the Weber Stake. Here in this far-off land, sweet mountain home, we enjoyed our holy religion, the Lord making known more fully unto us his ways, causing great joy in our hearts. In the spring of 1855, I moved to Farmington and was called to preside over the high priests of that branch. In 1856, I moved to Payson at the Council of Brigham Young and was called to preside over the high priests of that branch and was elected to city council. We enjoyed peace and tranquility in the land until Uncle Sam couldn't stand it any longer. In 1857, he sent an army of 13,000 men, causing our quietude to cease and oppose the work of God and his people. If we are the saints of God, we will be falsely accused. But the Lord overruled in this, and peace was restored again. So we will acknowledge his hand in all things. For eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of natural man, the blessings laid up in store for them that walk uprightly before him. For it is the spirit of our religion to keep the law of the land. If we keep the law of God, we have no need to break the law of the land. It is for us to deal justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. I have been in all the ups and downs of the church, from Jackson County, Missouri in 1832 until 1859. In that 27 years, we were driven 5 times from our homes because we had embraced the fullness of the gospel, the free gift of God to man. Notwithstanding all the persecution and tribulations we had to endure, the church has kept a steady onward march, increasing in knowledge and numbers continually, showing that the Lord is abundantly able to carry on his own work. So I will conclude by saying, I have not written the half, but what I have written is true. Horace Strong Rawson is the great-great-grandfather of Maureen Owen Barlow, mother of Hazel Barlow Zitting and Haven Barlow Sr.
Drusilla Doris was born on February 8, 1810, in Tennessee, the youngest of 10 children. She learned to read and write at the age of 7, her reading mostly consisting of studying the Bible and the hymn book. Of the Bible, Drusilla said, "I could recite passages without looking at the book." At the age of 18, Drusilla married James Hendricks. They lived in Kentucky while Drusilla cared for her aged parents. The Hendricks family began with the birth of Elizabeth in 1826, then William in 1829. At this time, word was spreading to move to the new Garden of Eden in Missouri. Curious, James wanted to move, but Drusilla asked if they could stay until the death of her parents. James conceded. During this wait, 2 more daughters were added to the family, Catherine in 1832 and Rebecca in 1835. Just before her mother's death, Drusilla and James joined the local Baptist church. Disappointed at not finding greater religious truth in worship services at this church, Drusilla felt no better satisfied than before. Yet, for 2 years she worshiped with the Baptists, until Mormon elders came to Kentucky preaching the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Her brother-in-law, Samuel Hendricks, insisted that Drusilla listen to the Mormon elders to prove their fraud. He said, "You have read so much that you can catch their errors in the Scripture." Curious, Drusilla went to hear them preach. Those elders brought the same light that Jesus had in the days of John the Baptist, she concluded. She returned home, rejoicing, although her brother-in-law was so mad he couldn't talk decently. It was difficult in the beginning for Drusilla to convince James to be baptized. She spent several months trying to persuade him that this was the way to truth and light. It wasn't until James witnessed a Latter-day Saint baptism that his heart was softened. He and Drusilla were baptized in March of 1835. Drusilla described her feelings at the time as, "So rejoiced. I could see fields of light and intelligence. I arose to walk in the newness of life. That fear of death and hell was all gone from me, and I was a new creature. Such a feeling of calmness pervaded me." By May of 1836, the family had readied themselves to join the saints in Clay County. They left Kentucky without incident and journeyed to Clay County, Missouri, where they purchased 50 acres of land before fears of persecution led them to move to Far West in Caldwell County. At first, their stay in Far West was peaceful. She wrote, "I never lived happier in my life. I was always sickly until now. I had quit taking snuff, tea, and coffee, and I became healthy and strong. When before I could not walk half a mile, now I could walk 3 and not tire, for we kept the word of wisdom." In order to make ends meet, Drusilla, with a family of 5 children under age 11, began raising a large garden. By taking in boarders and selling homemade items, she worked hard and was able to provide for her family. On Thursday, October 25, 1838, in the midst of the devastation of burned and trampled crops and murderous attacks by mobsters, neighbor children brought to Drusilla the report that her husband had been shot in the Battle of Crooked River and then dragged about by the merciless mob when unable to help himself. "I went to the field to give vent to my feelings. My husband was shot in the neck where it cut off all feeling of the body. It is of no use for me to try and tell how I felt, for that is impossible." Although his mind was unaffected, James remained paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life. Drusilla nursed her husband as the violence escalated. They were driven from their home and suffered starvation. Despite the crushing physical and emotional burdens that threatened her on every hand, Drusilla did not give up. For the next 34 years after this incident, Drusilla, with only the help of her children, cared for her husband, dressing and undressing him, lifting him in and out of bed, and all of the other mundane things he was unable to do for himself. In addition, she became the sole breadwinner and made the living for her family, since James was never able to work again. In March of 1838, Drusilla had given birth to their last child, a son. She and James asked the prophet Joseph to give their son a naming blessing when he came by to check on James after he was injured. The prophet named the new baby boy Joseph Smith Hendricks. Drusilla later testified to seeing the mantle of Joseph fall upon Brigham Young in August of 1844. She wrote, "President Brigham Young began to speak. I jumped up to look and see if it was not Brother Joseph, for surely it was his voice and gestures. Every Latter-day Saint could easily see upon whom the priesthood descended, for Brigham Young held the keys. Before joining the Mormon exodus from Nauvoo, Drusilla received her endowment on January 22, 1846, in the Nauvoo Temple. Driven out of Nauvoo, the Hendricks family was on its way to the Rocky Mountains when President Brigham Young called for men to join the Mormon battalion. As Drusilla thought upon the matter, she felt she could not endure having her son William, the only eligible member of her family, join. She rationalized, "My son was all I had to depend on, his father being helpless and my other son, Joseph, being only 9 years old, and my girls not very healthy." Yet, when Drusilla was alone, the whisperings of the Spirit suggested that William should join. A voice asked her, "Are you afraid to trust the God of Israel? Has he not provided for your wants?" Still, she argued, saying, "He's too young. He's all I have to help me make the 1,000-mile journey to the Rocky Mountains. My girls are sickly, and Joseph, his brother, is only 9 years old. How will I manage?" She then heard the voice ask, "Do you not want the highest glory?" She answered naturally, "Yes." The voice continued, "How do you think to gain it, save by making the greatest sacrifices?" She questioned, "Lord, what lack I yet?" This was a woman who justifiably felt that she had endured and sacrificed all that she could in the service of the Lord and her faith. Is this not enough? She wondered. But the voice answered again, strong and sure, "Let your son go into the battalion." During breakfast later that morning, Drusilla was still troubled with the thought of losing William. She had no photograph of him or any physical emblem of remembrance to comfort her heart, though she knew that full obedience to God was required. So, she took a photograph of him in her mind and said to herself, "If I never see you again till the morning of the resurrection, I shall know you are my child," she wrote. "I knelt down and told the Lord if he wanted William, to take him. Only spare his life and let him be restored to me and to the bosom of the church." I felt it was all I could do. Then the voice that talked to me earlier in the morning answered me, saying, "It shall be done unto you, as it was done unto Abraham when he offered Isaac on the altar." Believing these words were from God, Drusilla ran to William and told him she would hold him back no longer. An hour later, William was gone. At just 16, he would become the youngest member of the Mormon battalion. Drusilla and James, with their other 4 children, reached the Salt Lake Valley in October of 1847. Just 10 days previous, they had miraculously been joined by William, who had completed the epic march from California and continued with them to Salt Lake. They built a temporary dwelling by warm springs in Salt Lake and lived there 3 years. Then the family moved to Richmond, Cache County, where they lived until their deaths. She passed away at the age of 71 on May 20th, 1881. "The gospel is true," Drusilla testified. "I have rejoiced in it through all my trials, for the Spirit of the Lord has buoyed me up, or I should have failed." Drusilla's choice of courage and faithfulness amid trials was based on years of searching the Bible for truth. Once she embraced the truths of the Restoration, no obstacle or adversity could divert her from the faith she nourished and cherished. Her legacy of service to her husband and family and her commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ rose to heroic proportions. For Drusilla found in the extremes of life many reasons to rejoice and praise God. Drusilla's descendants include David Dockstader Sr., Boyd Dockstader, Harvey Dockstader, and many, many more.
I was born August 28, 1820, in Vermont. My parents, John and Lydia, were sincere believers in the established Christian religion of the day. In the spring of 1832, when I was 11, my father joined the Mormons. I felt worse, if possible, than if I had heard of his death. He was unworthy of recognition as a father. My mother did not approve of his course and felt that he had disgraced himself and family. For 2 years, my mother was earnestly and diligently engaged in reading the Bible, thinking to find something that would condemn Mormonism. I heard her say repeatedly that during those 2 years she had read the Bible more than she had all of her life before, and was greatly disappointed to find that the more she read, the more she found to condemn herself, and to confirm or establish Mormonism. After this rigid and thorough investigation, she desired to be baptized. Notwithstanding all this, I had not yet fully concluded to accept of Mormonism. Unknown to my parents, I went and heard a Mormon elder preach. Although my prejudices were strong in the favor of my acquaintances and against the Mormon elder, I found they could not produce any proof from the Bible to overthrow the doctrine or principles he advocated. In consequence, they soon began to use insulting and abusive language. From this I reasoned, has not the preaching of this man's opinion been strictly in harmony with the Bible that we all profess to believe? I was obliged to admit that notwithstanding the abusive and insulting attack upon him, his deportment has been that of a gentleman, and so my mouth was closed.
In the spring of 1838, they left for Missouri by wagon and arrived in October just as anti-Mormon troubles were at their height. William's father lived through the catastrophic Haun's Mill massacre and joined the Mormon exodus, eventually arriving in Quincy, Illinois.
In the spring of 1840, Father sent me to Nauvoo to transact some business with the prophet Joseph Smith. I arrived at his house about 9 o'clock, just as he was singing before his accustomed evening prayer, his wife Emma leading in the singing. I thought I had never heard such sweet, heavenly music before. I was equally interested in the prayer offered by the prophet. In January 1841, I got word that my mother was very sick and not expected to live. The next day, I rode 75 miles. On arriving at Nauvoo, I went to President Joseph Smith and was made welcome. The next morning, the prophet invited me to hitch up my horse with one of his in a buggy and ride with him. On this occasion, the subject of celestial or plural marriage was introduced to me. As we returned home, he remarked that if there was anything that I did not understand, to hold on a little and I would understand it.
William's mother died soon after. His sister Lucy wrote, "We were in the depths of despair, 10 motherless children, and the youngest was not yet 2 years old. My father's health seemed to give way under this heavy affliction. The prophet came to our rescue. He said, 'If you remain here, Brother Walker, you will soon follow your wife. You must have a change of scene, a change of climate. You have just such a family as I could love. My house shall be their home. I will adopt them as my own.' The prophet and his wife introduced us as their sons and daughters." William continues,
I settled up my business and returned again to President Joseph Smith and lived as a member of his family, taking an interest in his domestic affairs and remaining 3 years. The more extensive my acquaintance and experience became with him, the more my confidence increased in him. With my father being absent on a mission, the prophet asked my consent for my sister Lucy in marriage. I replied that if it was her choice, that if she entered into the celestial order of marriage of her own free will, that I had no objections. Instead of taking a course to deceive and prostitute and bring about her ruin, he took a straightforward, honorable, and upright course, in no way depriving her of her agency. When Father returned, the matter received his endorsement. It is claimed that Joseph Smith the prophet did not teach nor practice plural or celestial marriage. I know to the contrary. I positively know that he taught and practiced plural marriage. I know that others were his wives and lived in his family. I was just as well acquainted with these ladies as I was with Emma, his first wife. In 1842, under the direction of President Joseph Smith, my brother Lauren and myself took an active part in supplying the poor. This was the origin of the Relief Society. January 1843, I labored on the temple, loading and hauling rock, by which I smashed my fingers and was obliged to discontinue. I acted as bodyguard to the prophet and served in the Nauvoo Legion. In August, the mansion house was finished. The prophet and his family moved into it, and I had charge of the house under his direction. I was entrusted by him with important business. The Urim and Thummim was once placed in my charge for the time being, and many other important trusts were confided in me, which I am happy to say were held sacred. In regard to his private life, as to purity, honesty, virtue, charity, benevolence, liberality, refined and sensitive feelings, and nobility of character, his superior did not exist on earth. On November 1st, 1843, I married Olive Hovey Farr. I was 23 years of age. Still, I continued in the prophet's employ, and we had living with us 5 of my younger brothers and sisters, Olive being a mother to them and manager over all the female help in the mansion house. In the spring of 1844, a number of prominent men, having become disaffected, finally turned traitors to President Smith. He said, "If my life is of no value to the people, it is of no value to me." About sunset, June 23rd, he with his brother Hiram returned to the mansion house, overcome with grief. At first he could not speak, but as soon as he could control his feelings, he said he was going to give himself up for trial, and that he wanted me to go to Burlington that night to get a witness that did not belong to the church. Though I traveled night and day from the 22nd to the 28th, the dead bodies of the prophet and patriarch were brought and arrived in Nauvoo shortly after I did.
William spent the next several months working on the roof and dome of the Nauvoo Temple before receiving his endowments in December. Only 2 months later, William and Olive departed their beloved Nauvoo and crossed the frozen Mississippi to join the first company of migrating saints. After 4 months' travel came the call for the battalion. On that long, strenuous march, William suffered extensively from chills and fever, and experienced rather harsh treatment from some in command. He was finally sent with a sick detachment to Fort Pueblo to spend the winter before joining up with the saints near Fort Kearny in late spring. They arrived in the Salt Lake Valley on the first day of October, 1847. The first years in the valley were full of experiences. William's pioneering efforts did much to build up the saints. He built sawmills and grain mills, and fought crickets and Indians while farming and building 2 homes. He loved conquering the wilderness and building up his family and those around him. On the 28th of April, 1849, he was married to Mary Jane Shadden, a niece of Apostle John Taylor. In August 1852, church leaders sent the first public declaration of plural marriage to the world. At this time, William Walker received a mission call to South Africa. The arduous journey from Salt Lake to the Cape of Good Hope took 7 long months. Mobs, sometimes numbering 200 to 300 people, would hurl brickbats and rotten eggs at them, and they would often go for days at a time without food. With perseverance and determination, the South African mission proved to be very successful. William was grateful to the Lord's constant protection, and he served as the first mission president of the South Africa for over 2 years. When ready to head back to Utah across the plains, he was tasked with transporting all of the luggage, supplies, and provisions of a handcart company of 500 immigrants. In the spring of 1857, at the age of 36, Captain Walker headed west once more, in company with A. Milton Musser, Thomas B. Marsh, and Apostle John Taylor. William said,
I arrived in Salt Lake September 1st, 1857. I had been gone 5 years, minus 15 days. In that 5 years, I had traveled more than 40,000 miles.
William loved to tell of his arriving home in the evening, just at dark, and asking
if I could get accommodations overnight for my mule and myself. I was not recognized for some little time.
When word came to Utah that Johnson's army was coming, the Saints were advised to move south. While camped at the bottoms on the Provo River, Mary Jane gave birth to their third son in a covered wagon, who was named Don Carlos. Mary Jane promised Olive, William's first wife, that she could always claim Don Carlos because Olive could have no children of her own. This Don Carlos is who the Harker family is descended from. On August 30th, 1858, William married his third wife, Olive Louisa Bingham, who added dairying to his agriculture occupations. He also established a carding machine at Farmington before he was called by President Brigham Young to serve a mission into southern Utah. In company with his first wife, Olive H., he started upon this mission in May 1862. At Tokerville, where they settled, he helped strengthen the pioneering settlements by planting and harvesting fields of cotton, sugarcane, and grapevines, all the while freighting between Salt Lake, Boise, Missouri, and Southern California. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, and they passed their convictions, their lofty ideals, and their work ethic on to their children. At the age of 44, William married his fourth wife, Harriet Paul, and was sealed in the endowment house on April 22, 1865, to all of his wives. Harriet Paul and her family had been converted by Elder Walker in Cape Town, South Africa, and had later emigrated to Utah. In the spring of 1866, he arrived in Salt Lake City from the south, with 2 tons of cotton for President Young's mills. President Young released him from the Dixie Mission, so he concentrated his energies on his mills. In the fall of 1872, William H. Walker purchased a 112-acre farm on Big Cottonwood, now known as Holiday, Utah, resolving to turn his attention to farming in order to provide a way to teach his children farming and a work ethic. He straightaway built 3 houses and a schoolhouse, where 15 of his children attended. In April 1884, William moved to Louisville, Idaho, to escape the U.S. Marshal. Deputies were very diligent in seeking his arrest, but he managed to avoid them by cleverly hiding himself and relying on the Spirit to warn him. He was devoted and dedicated to his family, refusing to leave them, and did his best to keep them together and take care of them. During the winter of 1885 and over the next 5 years, he worked in the Logan Temple, performing ordinances for over 10,000 people. In 1891, he was engaged for 6 months laying floors in the Salt Lake Temple, using the same tools he had used in building the Nauvoo Temple 50 years before. On May 20th, 1892, William was ordained a high priest and patriarch under the hands of Presidents George Buchanan and Joseph F. Smith. After the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated in April 1893, William was working there 3 days a week, driving back and forth from his home in Holiday. He got up at 5 a.m. all winter and drove 10 miles and back again in the evening. For 2 winters he did not miss a day on account of cold nor storm. He loved this work. After a full life of dedicated service, Patriarch Walker passed away January 9, 1908, at 87 years of age. His final wish and instruction to his family was,
"That you all keep in the faith and remain true to the gospel, that you may have peace, joy, and happiness."
The numerous posterity of William Holmes Walker carries on his legacy and includes such individuals as Parley Joseph Harker, Rhoda Harker Hammond, Diane Harker Hammond, Alice Harker Hammond, and Elaine Harker Hammond.
Joseph Harker was born on February 28, 1818, in the little town of Poynton in Lincolnshire, England. Joseph's father died when he was 8 years old, providing that at an early age he and his brothers assumed the family responsibilities of running the 110-acre farm. When Joseph was 18 years old, he became sweethearts with Susanna Sneath, who lived on a farm nearby. Joseph's mother, Mary, did not approve. He offered to be married somewhere outside Great Britain or remain to run the family farm with her blessing. They received Mary's blessing, and Joseph became the primary son running the Shire farm. Early in life, Joseph had roles that drew on his integrity.
He was appointed constable for Poynton Parish when he was 21, and the following year he was appointed overseer of the poor for the parish. In 1842, after the birth of their first son, Joseph began to ponder more seriously the meaning of life and turned to religion to find answers. He began attending meetings of the Westlands with his older brother Amos. 2 years later, Amos introduced Joseph to Mormon missionaries, and he and Susanna were baptized by Amos on May 25, 1845. The next year, in 1846, the spirit of gathering seized the hearts of the Harkers, and they departed England. On their journey to Nauvoo, the Harkers took passage on a Mississippi riverboat. On this boat, tragedy struck their family. John, their oldest son, was playing with other children on the boat and in his excitement lost his balance and fell overboard. Joseph and Susanna only saw the little body disappear in the churn with his brightly dressed kilt. They often related that several sailors had to restrain them from jumping in after John. In 1847, Joseph and Susanna departed winter quarters for Utah under the leadership of Parley P. Pratt and John Taylor. While crossing the plains, Joseph was often called upon to feed the company. While Susanna drove the plodding ox team halfway across a continent, Joseph, gun in hand, hunted over prairie, mountain, and plain to help supply food for the company of pioneers. In September of 1847, shortly after arriving in Utah, Susanna gave birth to William, their fourth son. William was the first recorded white child born in Utah from the Mormon immigrants. 3 days after the arrival in Salt Lake Valley, Joseph, because of his knowledge of livestock, was asked to herd the company's cattle to ensure the pioneers would be able to survive the winter. Joseph was also called to help develop the large community farm and gather all types of greens. His 4-year-old son Job would ask what was for dinner. When thistles and greens were the answer, Job would crawl under the bed until the others had eaten their greens. Then he would go out and play. Susanna feared she would lose this son as well due to his stubbornness. With all her heart, she asked God to help her get something for her child to eat. Joseph Horn's children soon began sharing with Job a little of their bread, thus saving his life. This little Job would eventually have a grandson, Parley Joseph Harker, that would later settle in Short Creek, bringing with him his love of people, love of farming, and perhaps a little stubbornness for his posterity. In 1849, Joseph and Susanna Harker settled west of the Jordan River. They were the first Mormon family to settle west of the river, where they began a dugout cabin. During these years that followed, Joseph continued to be very active in the church. In 1851, he was ordained to an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood by George A. Smith, and the following year he was called to be the first counselor to the Bishop Robinson in the West Jordan Ward. Several years later, in 1857, in preparation to leave for a mission to Idaho, Joseph recorded in his journal that, "As we prepared again to leave for the Salmon River settlement at Fort Limhi, we plowed the lands and mended equipment. We did not neglect our religious obligations. On March 3rd, I took my family along with Samuel Benyon's families to Salt Lake and baptized them again, as was customary." In the year 1868, Joseph received a card from Brigham Young that admitted him to the School of the Prophets. He attended each Saturday. In 1881, Joseph's health began getting progressively poorer. He records, "I had pneumonia in the early part of the year and took a second attack in September. I was so sick I felt death crawling up my back. I knew I had but a few hours to live. I said, 'Father, I have been administered to by the priesthood. I have done my duties. I have paid my tithing and offering, yet the heavens appear as brass over me. If I lack anything, I will covenant to do better.' As I lay on my left side, I felt an unseen hand touch me on my right side. The pain left immediately, and all my fever was gone. It left me very weak." In May 1894, as Joseph perhaps felt his life drawing to a close, he went again to the Salt Lake Temple. This time, he obtained endowments and sealings for his father and mother, and all the children, including those that had passed, were sealed to him. The closing entry in Joseph's journal reads, "I now bear my testimony that the Lord Almighty has never left me, nor forsaken me from my childhood until the present time. Joseph passed away November 23, 1896, at his home and was buried in the Taylorsville Cemetery." Joseph Harker was blessed with great native intelligence, and he acquired knowledge and development through his experiences in youth and manhood. Following his acceptance of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he rapidly enlarged his faculties still further and developed leadership under the influence of the Holy Ghost. In the flux of a changing world, what Joseph Harker stood for stands unchanged. His toil, his courage, his vision, and his magnificent self-reliance are, like the man himself, immortal, and they are with us always. The descendants of Joseph Harker include Parley Joseph Harker, Rhoda Harker Hammond, Diane Harker Hammond, Elaine Harker Hammond, and Alice Harker Hammond.
William Black was born February 11, 1826, in Richland, Ohio, to John and Mary Klein Black. He was raised a member of the Baptist faith. William was temperate, thrifty, and industrious, and at 19 years old began to build his own house. During this time, William had made the acquaintance of the Banks family and began to fall in love with their daughter, Margaret Ruth Banks. He married Margaret just before his 21st birthday in February 1847. In January of 1849, news of the discovery of gold in California was spreading, and William caught the fever. On April 3rd, he kissed his expecting wife Margaret and one-year-old son Martin goodbye, and with high ambitions and a light heart, headed west for the goldfields of California. His journey took him to the Salt Lake Valley, where he arrived on July 24th, 1849.
As I entered their town, it appeared as the entire populace was assembled within a large brush bowery. At first I thought I had lost my reckoning and that this may be the Sabbath. But this couldn't be, as the Mormons were an unchristian, lawless set who doubtless paid no heed to the Sabbath.
William gained the acquaintance of one of these Mormons, Mr. Wordsworth, who explained to William the nature of their gathering in the Bowery that day and the reasons for the Mormons' migration west.
Their suffering and the martyrdom of their prophet was all news to me, and I wished to know more. To my surprise, Mr. Wordsworth invited me to attend their church services on the morrow. Sunday, the 25th of July, 1849, is a day ever to be remembered by me. The services opened with singing and prayer, and a sacrament of the Lord's Supper was blessed and passed to all the people. Then a man of noble, princely bearing addressed the congregation. As he arose, Mr. Wordsworth said, "This is the Apostle John Taylor, one of the two men who were with our prophet and patriarch when they were martyred in Carthage jail." The word apostle thrilled me, and the powerful sermon and testimony that followed filled my soul with joy and satisfaction that I never felt before. And I said to Mr. Wordsworth, "If that is Mormonism, then I am a Mormon. How can I become a member of your church?" That night I slept but little. I was too happy to sleep. A revelation had come to me, and its light filled my soul. My desire and ambition for gold was swept away. I had found a pearl of great price and resolved to purchase it, cost what it would.
William was baptized a few days later. He found employment as a stonemason under the superintendency of Daniel H. Wells on the council house. Here he became well acquainted with Brigham Young, who visited the site on a near daily basis. An opportunity to travel east became available, and William was anxious to return to Ohio for his family and carry the glad tidings of the gospel to his relatives. He felt impressed to seek President Young's counsel on the matter. President Young listened attentively to his expressions for a few moments, then replied quietly and slowly, "I think you had better stay here until you get better acquainted with us and the principles of the gospel. Should you return now, your friends may reject the gospel, and you, being young in the faith, might by their influence be weaned from it. I would advise you to stay longer." That settled it for William, who then set his mind to his work. When the council house was finished, he was told by President Wells that he had been selected to join a party being sent to Sanpete Valley to aid the settlements there. To this, William was admittedly very reluctant to obey. He had heard Sanpete was a cold and frosty place, with an altitude too high for agricultural purposes, and felt his temporal conditions would not be bettered. He began to doubt in his mind the right of the president to call him to this mission.
I understood and expected them to guide me in spiritual matters, but this was of a temporal nature and beyond their jurisdiction. These were my thoughts, and this pioneer calling was the first trial to my faith. I am pleased to say the pause was only for a moment. Upon my reflection of God's dealings with Noah, Abraham, Moses, Lehi, and Nephi, I found strong evidence that my reasoning and traditions were incorrect. Was not God the author of the world as well as of the gospel? If he built the earth, why not govern it? If it requires union of spirit and matter to bring exaltation to men, then it must be that the priesthood has the right to direct in material as well as spiritual things.
He then sought out Brother Wells and expressed his willingness to go to Sanpete, or anywhere else he would be sent. In Manti, he was welcomed by presiding patriarch Isaac Morley. Upon learning William was without family, Father Morley expressed, "Come and be my boy." William spent 2 years living and working with Isaac Morley, whom he began to regard as his father, and adapted his name to William Morley Black.
From Father Morley, I learned of the revelation given to the prophet Joseph Smith, which says, "I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant, and if ye abide not that covenant, then ye are damned. For all who will have a blessing at my hand shall abide the law that was appointed to that blessing." To my understanding at that time, that meant plural marriage, and I accepted it.
William was introduced to a young lady named Amy Jane Washburn. He told her of his wife and 2 young children in Illinois, and his desires to go and bring them to Utah. With this understanding, she was willing to marry him, and the two were married by Patriarch Isaac Morley in February of 1851. In October of that same year, he again had the opportunity to travel east, and was reunited with his wife and his family 2 years and 7 months after leaving on his quest for gold.
To my joy, I found my wife Margaret and the children Martin and Martha well. She received me as one from the dead, for though I had written to her, she feared I would never return. When I revealed I had been baptized into the Mormon Church, my mother-in-law was wild with rage and abused me without repose. And Father Banks gave me to understand that a Mormon was not welcome beneath his roof. It was not a trial. My faith was not shaken. I had received light, and I knew my duty and was resolved to do it. That evening I told Margaret, "You are my wife, and I love you, but I love God better. I'm going to harness my horses and leave your father's roof. If you want to go with me, have your things ready. Otherwise, I will take Martin and leave you with Martha and bid you goodbye."
At daylight, he found her and the children packed and ready to go.
From that time on, Martha's trust in me was of great comfort. She also knew that I had married Amy Jane and was prepared to meet the new conditions my actions had brought to us. She accepted cheerfully her share of increased responsibilities that plural marriage brings to all who enter into it. And all the rest of her life, she was a real mother and helpmate to my large family. Margaret and Amy Jane lived together cheerfully, and our lives were happy and contented.
In 1859, William married Maria Hansen of Denmark as his third wife. During his time working with Father Morley in Manti, William gained experience in the construction and operation of grist mills. This would become his calling and career throughout his life. As he and his families would move from Manti to Circle Valley, to Beaver, to Dixie, Kanab, and to Glendale, establishing and operating mills for the Mormon settlements. In 1869, William married Louisa Ann Washburn, and in 1874, William married widow Sarah Miranda Thompson.
In 1874, President Young and George A. Smith visited southern Utah and put forth their best efforts to organize the people into working companies called the United Order. To me, the effects of these settlements were wonderful. Those who joined the order were consecrating all their wealth. They seemed baptized with a new zeal that filled their souls with energy, goodwill, and brotherly love, while those who opposed it were filled with jealousy and hatred. I cast my lot with the Orderville community, consecrating my farm and teams and interest in the Kanab mill. In fact, my worldly all was put in upon the altar, and I sacrificed in a cause that I believe was instituted for the good of the human family. Under Brigham Young's watchful eye, the order prospered.
William operated the order's grist mill and oversaw the great dining hall, which fed the community, growing to about 600 persons, 2 meals daily. In 1887, he spent the year playing hide-and-seek from the U.S. Marshal. He grew tired of that game, and in the fall of 1888, William took his wife Louisa and youngest family and fled to Old Mexico, passing through Lee's Ferry on his way. William believed in keeping his families together whenever conditions would permit.
In union there is strength, in family as well as nations.
Just before Christmas of 1890, William was able to reunite the remainder of his family with him in Diaz, Mexico. On the 14th of May, 1903, Apostle Matthias F. Cowley ordained William Morley Black a patriarch. In 1912, a Mexican rebel war broke. To avoid the conflict, William and his families fled back to the United States. They traveled by train to El Paso, Texas, where William and company were received warmly by Apostle Ivans. William had spent 25 years in the Mormon colonies of Mexico. Shortly before his death at age of 88, William signed his testimony.
I know that God lives, and that Joseph Smith was and is a true prophet of God. And I know that his life's labors were approved by the Father, and that Joseph Smith has received a crown of glory as a reward for his faithfulness. I feel grateful to my Heavenly Father for his leading me to a knowledge of the gospel of his Son, which has brought to me an ordination to the patriarchal priesthood. And I have received the blessings of wives and numerous posterity, and that my children may know that I am humbly proud and thankful of these blessings.
A few of William Black's living descendants include Arvin Black, Elizabeth Hammond, Lita Hammond, and Valia Williams.
Warren Marshall Johnson was born July 9, 1838, at Bridgewater, New Hampshire. He was raised a Methodist and received his early education at Boston and Bridgewater. Delicate and sickly, Warren was frequently under doctor's care. He had a bad case of ulcers and nearly succumbed in the winter of 1865 to 1866. The doctor gave him less than a year to live, but said he could increase his lifespan somewhat if he moved to a milder climate. During the spring of 1866, 2 of Warren's friends were drawn to the allure of gold and determined to travel to California and try their luck at mining. Warren was invited to join them, and he decided that a trip west might benefit his health. The 3 men left Boston on horseback early in May 1866. They followed the Oregon Trail and by late July had reached southern Idaho. Here, Warren's ailments flared up so intensely that he decided to seek a doctor. Qualified medical knowledge was difficult to come by out west, and the men were advised to head for Salt Lake City. This was quite an ordeal for the sick man, but he managed to reach Farmington, Utah, and the home of Dr. Jonathan Smith. Unable to travel further and not wishing to delay his companions, he urged them to continue, planning to follow them when he felt better. But Warren never reached California. He lay under a tree in Dr. Smith's yard, where his eldest daughter, Permelia, found him lying. She thought he was dead and reported to her folks there was a dead man in the yard. Gradually, Warren's health improved under the attentive care he received. Warren and Permelia Jane were mutually attracted, and it is said that when he found the Mormons did not have horns, he began to study their gospel. Convinced he had found the true religion, he embraced the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith with all the fervor of one who had just made a great discovery. His life began anew. On the 30th of September in 1866, Warren M. Johnson was baptized at Farmington. On July 7, 1867, he was ordained an elder in the LDS Church and was sent, with others, to support the Muddy Mission in southern Nevada. As colonizations went, the Muddy was one of the roughest that confronted the Mormon pioneers. Searing summer heat, sudden floods, constant blowing winds and sand, and tormenting Indians harassed these settlers as in no other place. This was the environment confronting Warren Marshall Johnson when he arrived at St. Thomas during the late summer of 1867. Being single and comparatively well educated, his talent was recognized, and he became a schoolteacher and a leader in the community. In his spare time, he worked a small farm. Warren had some unfinished business in Farmington and returned there in 1869. On October 4th, he and Permelia Jane Smith were married. The couple then returned to St. Thomas, and he resumed teaching. In the summer of 1870, Brigham Young then approved the abandonment of Muddy, and in February of 1871, the colonists followed his recommendation and moved en masse to present-day Glendale. Warren continued working as a teacher and farmer, while also acting as bookkeeper and clerk in the store. On October 28, 1872, Warren married his pupil, Samantha Nelson. After the first hard year, the little settlement began to thrive, and Warren's wives and family viewed the future optimistically. As the results of the horrible events of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, John D. Lee could no longer run Lee's Ferry, and the church needed a replacement. Bishop Spencer requested that Warren take over Lee's Ferry on a temporary basis. Warren took his wife Permelia and their first baby, Mary, to Lee's Ferry, arriving March 30th, 1875. He took up the 10-acre land claim and immediately went to work on the little cabin to make it livable again. Warren was initiated into the constant job of repairing the dam crossing the Paria and bringing water to the dry fields. Warren did not naturally possess the knowledge, skills, and strength for the jobs he had to perform at Lee's Ferry, but he acquired them. Not only did he adapt to the harsh conditions of his new home, but he thrived and provided help and comfort to the less fortunate who passed by his door. It appears that Warren soon agreed to take the job on a more permanent basis. George Q. Cannon read his name in General Conference in Salt Lake City on October 10, 1875, with his official notification dated the following day, specifying that Warren was called to a life mission at Lee's Ferry. Warren had 20 children, 4 of whom died after being exposed to diphtheria by travelers that had come through, who had buried a child and did not disinfect themselves or the wagon. Warren wrote of the experience in a letter to Wilford Woodruff.
We knew nothing of the nature of the disease, but had faith in God as we were here on a very hard mission, and had tried as hard as we knew how to obey the word of wisdom, and to attend to the other duties of our religion, such as paying tithing, family prayers, and etc., that our children would be spared. But, alas, in 4.5 days my son choked to death in my arms. 2 more were taken down with the disease, and we fasted and prayed as much as we thought wisdom, as we had many duties to perform here. We fasted 24 hours, and I once fasted 40 hours, but to no avail, for both of my little girls died also. About a week after their death, my 15-year-old daughter, Melinda, was also stricken down, and we did all we could for her, but she soon followed the others. I would ask for your faith and prayers in our behalf, however. What have we done that the Lord has left us? And what can we do to gain his favor again? Yours in the gospel, Warren M. Johnson.
He served there for 20 years, experiencing hardships beyond imagination and joy unmatched. It may be said that Jacob Hamlin explored this gateway for Mormon colonization. John D. Lee settled it, and Warren Johnson made it bloom. Warren's ready hospitality and his great faith provided much succor and spiritual courage to the pioneer colonists who ventured into the inhospitable Arizona desert across the Colorado River. He was known throughout the far-flung Mormon settlements, and his name was recorded with affection in many pioneer journals. In the late fall of 1895, it was decided that Warren's mission had ended, and that the remnant of his family should also have the opportunity of schooling and church activity. While traveling from Fredonia to Lee's Ferry, he stopped for a load of hay with Kanab stake president Edwin D. Woolley. The hay rack tipped, throwing both men to the ground. Brother Woolley landed on his feet, but Warren came down heavily on the base of his spine. His back never healed, and for the rest of his life, he was paralyzed from the hips down. He lived 7 years in bed and wheelchair, but his faith never wavered. Despite being unable to walk, he sold everything he had to support yet another church-sponsored pioneer colonization in Byron, Wyoming. He headed out with his cattle and his broken back, ready to do the work asked of him. He left Kanab July 17, 1901, with about 100 head of cattle, traveling for 2 months, and arrived in Byron on September 7th. Warren settled in a place they called Coburn, and Warren the presiding elder. The winter was a hard one, and his cattle did not survive. His health failed. His backbone was overlapped an inch or so, and gangrene had set in. His flesh literally rotted from his bones, and he died March 10, 1902. His lineage carried on in the priesthood work, doing much to bless the lives of those around them. His descendants include such names as President Leroy S. Johnson, Patriarch Warren Elmer Johnson, Nelda Johnson, Fanny DeCauley, and many more.
Jacob Larsen was born September 8, 1869 in Denmark to Niels Larsen and Larsine Jacobsen. They were baptized into the Mormon Church in 1870 by Mormon missionaries. At 8 years old, Jacob's parents sent him and his younger brother to Utah. They arrived in Richfield on July 24, 1878. Living with different families, working hard for their support and to learn the English language. Their parents joined them 5 years later in 1883. He had minimal schooling until 1887, when he worked as a janitor to pay for his tuition at Sevier Stake Academy. Jacob and Annie Pratt Gardner were married in the Manti Temple on June 19, 1889. They purchased a small, old adobe house in Richfield. He was 20 and she was 22. Jacob became involved in public and political positions, including a job as county assessor. In the spring of 1899, leaving behind his wife and 6 children, Jacob served a mission in Norway. When he returned, Jacob was elected judge of the Municipal Court of Richfield. He served 3 consecutive terms. He made his first visit to St. George in 1909. He was impressed enough by the area to purchase 400 acres of what eventually was called the Bloomington Bench. He wrote, "During my travels in Dixie, I became interested in a much larger irrigation project which contemplated the storing of floodwaters of the Virgin River up on top about 8 or 10 miles above Rockville. The stored water would be used to irrigate a large body of valuable land in southern Utah and northern Arizona." Jacob was spending so much time in southern Utah he decided to move his family there in 1910. He hired an engineering firm to study the feasibility of his irrigation project, during which time they discovered an amphitheater near the head of Short Creek Canyon. Unfortunately, the investors backed out of the project when Jacob was unable to induce the railroad to extend its line into Dixie. During this time, Jacob took an excursion with Bishop Gifford of Springdale. Traveling on horseback, they climbed to the top of the mountains south of Rockville, where Jacob Larsen first saw Short Creek from the top of a mountain ledge high above Canaan. He wrote, "It was a breathtaking panorama that spread out before us. 2 lakes sparkled in the evening sun. They were the Canaan Lake and the Short Creek Lake, both full of water. The sight of these lakes astonished us, as we had not heard of them, and they added greatly to the beauty of the view. How this virgin paradise lay vast and silent, spread out before our view, like a new page from the book of nature. It is therefore not surprising that I should gaze upon it all as in a dream. I seem to see this vast expanse dotted with cities and towns, fields and forests. It was only a daydream, and yet I am sure it was prophetic of the day when the great Colorado shall contribute of water to the development of this great empire. Within a few weeks, Jacob petitioned the Arizona legislature for culinary and irrigation water rights to bring water into the valley. The rough terrain would make this a costly and difficult task, but he set to work on what would become known as the Larson Irrigation Ditch. Larson's farming plans directly threatened grazing for local cattlemen. Jacob wrote, "I was duly warned that if I persisted in my activities, I would probably turn up missing some morning. But when their threats didn't work, the cattlemen backed down." For several months, Larson worked under the blazing blue skies, clearing the land, planting crops, and tending his animals in the fields. His family remained behind in Richfield while Jacob prepared a tent home for them. He finally brought his family to Short Creek in the spring of 1912, where they lived in a tent for 2 years before building a permanent home. Twice, the family ran out of provisions altogether. Once, Jacob walked nearly 60 miles to St. George in 13 hours, with only 2 soda biscuits and a handful of raisins to sustain him. Jacob wrote, "As soon as we had the water out and began growing crops, it looked like a permanent settlement. I think I should have credit for being the first person to successfully initiate a settlement on the Strip in opposition to the wishes of the cattlemen. It began to look like law and order had at last made its appearance on the Strip. Homeseekers took courage, and soon we had neighbors. First came Loren Covington, and later Orland F. Colvin, Frank Johnson, and others. Before any settlers came, we already had a public school running. The first post office was in a dugout with Elizabeth Colvin as postmistress. Jacob became the first justice of the peace, and Isaac Carling was appointed constable. With the help of his sons and a lot of hard work, the ranch was now in good shape. They were producing enough for most of their needs and were able to sell some of their crops. Jacob wrote, "We were in a situation now when I might have settled down to enjoy the fruits of our labor and to take life a little easier. But seemingly I was not content to do that. I was in the prime of life, 50 years, and full of energy and ambition. In the place of being resigned to enjoy what I had, I was restless to acquire more." After seeing a pamphlet describing a settlement project in California, Jacob decided to move there, leaving his inexperienced boys to run the ranch. After his efforts failed, he returned to Short Creek and found his ranch in total disrepair. Jacob wrote, "In reality, I have pioneered Short Creek twice. The ditch was in such shape that we practically had to build a new one. We had no team or equipment. I bought a cow from the Canaan Ranch that I practically paid for with pine nuts, which I gathered." Despite his past activity in the church, Jacob's faith in the doctrine was not strong. Once back at the ranch, Jacob made the decision to no longer attend church. He wrote, "I have never been what religious people call very spiritual. While the family was growing up, I went to church largely through duty. Children should have some religious training, and I went with them to encourage them. Now, that necessity no longer exists." Jacob was involved in many community events and projects. He was always interested in the law and had some experience in the legal field. Jacob was elected Justice of the Peace and served in that capacity for several years, completing a course in law by correspondence in 1938. In the community of Short Creek, Jacob was referred to as the Judge because he would help people with their legal matters. In 1935, polygamists began moving to Short Creek. Within 5 years, they started the United Effort Plan and slowly started taking more control of the town. Jacob was opposed to this situation and resisted some of their efforts. By 1949, Jacob was 80 years old. His sons were relocating, and it was no longer feasible for him to maintain his ranch alone. Jacob moved to Hurricane, Utah, where he passed away in 1956. His descendants include Michael Pledger Sr. and Michael Pledger Jr. On October 14, 1894, Isaac Warren Carling was born to Elizabeth Johnson and Isaac von Wagner Carling Jr. A year later, Isaac Jr. passed away to pneumonia. When Isaac Warren Carling was 6 years old, his mother took him to conference in Kanab. Apostle Francis M. Lyman was there. After meeting opened, Apostle Lyman looked down over the audience and pointed to Isaac and said, "Little boy, come up to the stand." Apostle Lyman stood him up on the pulpit and said, "He will someday become a great man and do a mighty work in the Lord's kingdom." He told the other little boys to follow Isaac's example. He told Isaac to remember that he had shook hands with a man that had seen and shook hands with the prophet Joseph Smith. In June 1900, at the advice of Apostle John W. Taylor, Warren Johnson, Isaac's grandfather, gathered up his family and started for Salt Lake City, eventually settling in Bighorn Country, Wyoming. A year later, Lizzie sold her property in Kanab and joined her father in Wyoming. Following Apostle Wilford Woodruff's counsel that all widows get married and raise families, Elizabeth Johnson Carling married Orland F. Colvin in November 1902. In 1908, they moved to Orderville, Utah, and by 1911, they had moved to Pipe Springs, Arizona, to take care of a ranch for Jonathan Heaton. They ran a hotel there and took care of the travelers. Occasionally, Orland and Lizzie would travel to St. George and go through the temple. They were considering purchasing land in Santa Clara when they met with David H. Cannon, president of the St. George Temple, who looked them square in the eyes and said, "You go to Short Creek. That is where you belong." Orland Colvin and his stepson Isaac W. Carling, now 16, went to Short Creek to get the land ready for crops and put up fencing. They obtained the land by homesteading and hauled lumber from the sawmill on Mount Trumbull to build their home in Short Creek. They lived in Pipe Springs for 3 years and moved to Short Creek in 1914. They were the third family to move to Short Creek and the first family to build a house. On June 27, 1918, Isaac Carling married Elva Walker from Eden, Utah, and brought her to Short Creek to live. Isaac was the spiritual leader of Short Creek and had set up a branch of the church belonging to the Rockville Ward. Isaac was the presiding elder of this branch and held that office from 1916 until 1934. In 1924, because of a drought, the crops failed. Food was scarce and times were hard. There was not much opportunity for paying jobs in the area. Isaac Carling went to Salt Lake City and got a job working for Baldwin Radio Plant. The factory owner, Nathaniel Baldwin, was a prominent Utah inventor. More importantly, Baldwin was a believer in continuing plural marriage and felt it was his religious duty to help others who were also committed to it. His patronage drew polygamists and would-be polygamists to work at his factory. As a result, as many as 10 to 20% of Baldwin's employees were from families of post-manifesto plural marriages or had inclinations toward plural marriage. It was there Isaac learned about the priesthood operating outside the church. He met John W. Woolley, Lauren C. Woolley, John Y. Barlow, Joseph Musser, Leslie Broadbent, Daniel R. Bateman, Joseph Smith Jessup, and others who would later be instrumental in carrying on the Lord's work. At this time, Isaac began to study the gospel as never before. He remembered hearing President Joseph F. Smith say that they would be safe in following all the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. He also knew that the current president of the LDS Church and his apostles were against plural marriage. His grandfather, Isaac Sr., had told him that he had heard the prophets say that the time would come when the people could not go halfway in living the gospel. they would have to live all the laws that the Lord has given for this generation, and they will never be taken away or given to another people. The saving principles of the gospel are plural marriage and the united order, and if we reject these laws, we will come short of the glory we are seeking for. There is no other way. Isaac decided to put the matter of plural marriage before the Lord, fasting 3 days at a time. The Lord gave him understanding that the law was still binding upon the people, and if they did not obey this law, they would lose the wife they already had and would be damned. He decided to obey plural marriage and began preaching it. As a result, he received a letter from President Grant, his stake president, and his bishop, advising him to leave plural marriage alone and that the devil was influencing him. Isaac then took the matter before the Lord again, and his testimony was made even stronger. In 1926, shortly after Leroy Johnson moved to Short Creek, Isaac Carling told him there was a man he wanted him to meet down in Rockville, whose name was Bishop Gifford. This was the same Bishop Gifford who had brought Jacob Lauritsen to see the Short Creek area. He was an old man now and had been well acquainted with the prophet Brigham Young. Isaac Carling and Leroy Johnson went to see him, and Brother Gifford said, "I'm going to tell you boys something I want you to remember. I had President Brigham Young and George Q. Cannon in my buggy. When we got to that Cedar Ridge, Brigham Young had me stop. He stood up in the carriage, held out his hand, and said, 'Someday this will be the head and not the tail of the church. This will be the granaries of the saints.'" In 1928, polygamist Leroy Johnson, Edner Allred, and Carling Spencer, as well as monogamist Price Johnson, left their homes in nearby Lee's Ferry to lead their families to Short Creek as a starting point for the gathering of the saints. Jacob Lauritsen had returned from California just the year before. In 1931, Netta Nolan Hull Cox, a plural wife of Isaac Carling, died at Short Creek. Isaac buried her at the foot of the East Mountain, which would later become known as the Isaac Carling Memorial Cemetery. About this time, Isaac Carling and John T. Spencer decided to start a small store. They each put in $51.70, making $103 total as capital stock. The store was set up in Isaac Carling's living room and was called the Spencer and Carling Mercantile Company. Isaac had the only truck in town, so he hauled in the supplies from Cedar City. In 1932, Isaac Carling wrote to the Brethren in Salt Lake about the possibility of making a community for the saints in Short Creek. He proposed Short Creek as a potential refuge from the heated confrontation between the fundamentalists, the Mormon Church, and the government. At the time, Utah had increased the crime of unlawful cohabitation from a misdemeanor to a felony. Isaac invited his friends to Short Creek and began giving them parcels of his land to build on. On August 30th, 1934, Isaac Carling was excommunicated from the church. 1 year later, 22 members, including Leroy Johnson, were cut off from the Mormon Church's Short Creek branch because they would not denounce plural marriage. They had refused to sign a loyalty oath that LDS President Heber J. Grant had sent to church members whose actions or loyalties might be suspect. In April 1935, Joseph W. Musser, John Y. Barlow, Ianthus W. Barlow, and Richard S. Jessup, leaders of the fundamentalists, traveled to Short Creek to examine the community and discuss the possibility of organizing under the umbrella of a formal trust and controlling the same in the interest of the work of the Lord. Musser remembered, "We met with the priesthood there, held several meetings, and decided to go ahead with the proposition." Jacob M. Lauritsen found the newcomers a friendly and sociable lot, but doubted they would prosper because he and his sons controlled much of the water rights to the most promising areas. However, the fundamentalists believed that the problem would be resolved through a prophetic promise. In 1935, John Y. Barlow taught the little colony of less than 100 members that the dry creek beds and sagebrush-covered fields of Short Creek were the land of bountiful spoken of in the Book of Mormon, where Christ had blessed the little children on his visit to the Nephites and promised that the land would be rich and yield abundant crops. Thus, while this section was unattractive and unproductive, recalled Larson later with some amazement, it acquired a hallowed and secret aspect for those people by reason of these teachings. Leroy Johnson remembered that the fundamentalists offered the site as a starting place for the gathering of the saints, choice above all other spots of ground in the surrounding country. The statement was made that the time would come when 1 acre of this ground would produce more than 10 acres of the best soil in Salt Lake Valley. The fruits of this richness would only materialize, Johnson reminded the fundamentalists, when you are united. The winter of 1936 was cold and severe. There was nothing to feed the cows except weeds. When the weeds were gone, Isaac Carling fed them cactus after he burned the thorns off. From 11 cows, he got 8 quarts of milk. When he delivered the milk around to the people, each person got a half a cup per day. Sometimes there was only enough for the babies. In the spring of 1938, John Y. Barlow made a trip down Big Bend to see how things were going. While there, he had a vision that the Lord was going to take one of the faithful elders. He went back to Short Creek and found Isaac Carling very sick. Isaac had seen the same vision and knew that the Lord needed him on the other side. He died at the age of 43 on June 12, 1938. He was buried in the cemetery he had started a few years before. Isaac Carling's mother, Elizabeth Johnson, is the sister of President Leroy S. Johnson and was known by many as Aunt Lizzie. Some of her posterity includes Lita Hammond and Elizabeth Hammond.
These were true pioneers, people with the willingness to sacrifice everything they had and face the unknown for the promise of a better life. Is the pioneering spirit a thing of the past? Have people stopped finding reasons to uproot their lives in search of greater value? Does the internal fortitude still exist within people to improve their lives? Pioneers do still exist in modern times. They live among us, making whatever sacrifice necessary for what they believe in. These are the stories of a few of our modern pioneers.
Name's Al Yarish, originally from New Jersey, northern Jersey, not too far from New York City. Moved west in 1963 to Texas and came out to Salt Lake in Utah in 1986. First time I came down here was in the late 80s, and I just fell in love with the mountains, the clean air, everything surrounding this area. Found out after a while, I had my wife open her clinic. I helped her do that. The people were just fantastic, and I've always enjoyed the association I've had here. I moved here permanently in 2006, and I'm glad I did. This is the place to be. We have great people, we have a great community, and I don't recommend a lot of people moving here because I don't want it to get crowded, but we're going to stay. This is home.
I'm Holly Timpson. I grew up in Sandy, Utah. I was raised LDS. Later I met Marion and we started dating, and I fell in love with him, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just think we're going to get married. We were married for 7 years, and he decided to get rebaptized, and I went to his baptism, and I just felt like I just had this panic attack the whole time, like this isn't what I'm supposed to do, because I didn't want to stand in the way of what God wanted for him, but that's not what God wanted for me. And I was never going to live plural marriage or be in a religion for a man. It always was what God wanted. And then I had one of those heart-to-hearts with myself, like this reality check, that I was so busy asking God to not let this be true that I never asked him if it was. And so I had to start asking those tough questions and figuring out for myself instead of saying, oh, I know for sure, you know. And it took a year of coming down south and making good friends with people here, and just kind of starting to see the pros of plural marriage instead of like feeling gross about it, because it just goes against your nature, and started to just fall in love with this family, became really good friends with his family, and being like, actually, these people are way smarter than me, and they're very educated, and this is what they believe. They're not like crazy. Like, this is what they believe. And I started really looking up to them, particularly his mom. And so I started asking all of these questions for a year, and started to get a strong feeling like, crap, he was right, and now I've got to do this. And then in October, I got baptized. And then that was of 2010. And then a couple months went by, and I was like, you know what, I think we're supposed to move down south. And he's like, I was just thinking that same thing. And then from there, it just, all the doorways opened to get our family down here, so.
I am Amber Mahan Knutson, and I am originally from Kalispell, Montana. I was working at the hotel in Montana with a gaggle of people from out here, and got interested in the stories, and asked one of my friends to show me what this was about. And I've never gone to a place that it wasn't the people, it wasn't the mountains, it wasn't the environment physically so much as the feeling that made me want to stay and become part of just everything around it. Then I went home and quit my job and packed up my 4-year-old, and we moved here. One of my first and only meetings with Brother John, I remember him saying something that I completely took to heart, which was something along the lines of, your family and your father are not here. And that means that it is my job to be that person for you. So having somebody else acknowledge that and take that on was beyond heartwarming. I don't have a term that fully encompasses everything that meant by the end of that meeting.
I'm Sarah Byrne Knutson, and I was born in Birmingham, England. My parents are Church of England, which is somewhat non-committal Christian. But it wasn't something where there was ever a goal in life. It was all, I guess, their idea of heaven is just angels and harps and singing, and I have absolutely no idea. But there isn't a how to make yourself a better person. And I think that's what it's missing completely, which doesn't make any sense. I read the Quran and I read a bunch of other religious books. I actually just found a Book of Mormon, Cliff Notes version, and read it. And I guess what appealed to me was the idea of a actual way of life. Something that was actually meant to do something, to make you do something with your life. So I contacted the church. I read some of the journals of discourses and etc., and then found some discrepancies, and so I started to ask questions. They couldn't really answer the questions. They weren't rude about it, they just couldn't answer the questions. One day I typed in something and I cannot tell you what it was, and I found CPAC online, so I sent some incredibly embarrassing email to CPAC. I would never want to know what it was again. And someone from him emailed me back, and then we talked for, 9 months or something, maybe a year even. And then I came out here to visit, 2 weeks to begin with. And then I came in May, I think, 2012. And then I came back in October of 2012, and that was when I made the decision that I wanted to be here and made that commitment.
I was Cecile Pasquinelli, and I've married Adrian Hammond, and now I'm Cecile Hammond. I came from California. I still owned a business, a sandwich shop in the South Bay of San Francisco, and Adrian came in as a customer, and long story short, he told me about the work. And I had been frustrated with my life because I had become so focused on money that I realized I had become a person I didn't like. And I was hurting people inadvertently through it. And when Adrian started talking about the gospel to me, I listened because I had been praying to God to help me figure out a way to become a better person. And so I investigated the work, and every time I came, there were people who were very nice. So it was quite a change to leave everything. I left my family, my friends, my home, my job, the way I dressed, and I can't say that there aren't days that I miss some of the things, but I would never want to go back. There's more people in the outside that just accept who they are and accept their faults and just live life. They aren't constantly trying to improve and be better people. There are those kinds of people here also, but the majority of the people here, I would say, are still trying to become better people. And I like being around that. I like having neighbors that I really like and trust, and I like the school. I've never experienced such love from Adrian, Ida, Grandma Linda, and those kids. I'm truly, truly blessed.
My name is Melissa Rain. I'm from a small town in New Hampshire called Newton. It's on the Massachusetts border, an hour north of Boston, Massachusetts. I'm here because I explored other religions and nothing made sense until I found the priesthood. I grew up Roman Catholic. I did Baptist for a while.
How did you first hear about the priesthood?
Actually through Ben. We happened to go to Colorado State University with each other at the same time. We met in student government, and it was just meeting up with him and started talking. And actually he was reluctant to talk about his background, but eventually we did, and then studying the Book of Mormon and asking questions. And I had known him, 6 weeks before I came down here. I just came down on a whim during winter break, and then I met with quite a few people and talked and had discussions on the gospel. And then from then on, I started adding to my own collection of what Ben had for books. And before I had left to go back to school, I was baptized. And then we got married, and now we have girls, and now they're growing up, and yeah. So it was something that, after praying and reading and all of that, it was the one thing, like I said before, made sense, because this is where the priesthood is.
My name is Kenny Powell. I left Vernal, Utah in the winter of 53 when I was 3 years old, and I lived in LA. I've moved around the United States since then, and the reason that I'm here is because I was reading my scriptures, and in Doctrine and Covenants it gets into depth about polygamy, and I saw this program entitled Polygamy USA of the National Geographic Station, a 4-part series, and every part of it had part of me in it. So I came over here on blind faith, and much to my surprise, I got welcomed by everybody and the community, and it was all through blind faith and all the love this community has. I've never been accepted by so many people in one place in my life. And I came here to live the law of polygamy as it is in Doctrine and Covenants, and keep on serving the community as I have, and be active in the church. And hopefully, because of my construction background, I wanted to be involved in the building of a temple. That's probably the main reason I came down here.
I'm Brian Reed. I was born in Northern California, and prior to moving to Centennial Park, I lived in Pocatello, Idaho with my wife and kids. And a show that I was watching on TV called Polygamy USA came out, and I'd been searching my whole life for answers to questions no one would answer. So I spent the next 4 years trying to make it down to Centennial, and it was a struggle because every time I planned it out, the devil would come in and take all the funds. So then in 2017, while I was attending college, I felt this, if you do it, I'll make it happen kind of feeling. And after my first class, I called my wife and I'm gonna come home, we're gonna go pick up our daughter. We're gonna go to Centennial. We came down, and the first person that we actually physically met from the work was Arthur. I've been around the world, and this has been the place that has always it feels like this is where I've belonged my whole life. So we had to go back up and sell our house, and I had to finish out my college. And it was less than a month later that I officially moved it down, but I had gotten baptized back in April of 2017. So if I was just here for the polygamy side of things, I could have stayed in Idaho, or I could have gone to California, or I could have gone anywhere. But the thing is the priesthood is here, and that's where I need to be, is where the priesthood is.
So I am Crystal Chatterton Reed. I am from Pocatello, born and raised. Pocatello, Idaho, I should be more specific. What brought me here was my husband, actually. My heart kind of got excited. I was excited to be able to find out and be able to know what it was really all about, because in the mainstream church, you don't really talk about it. Everything's kind of just been swept under the rug. And you're told that polygamy is for the afterlife. It's not for here on earth. And so to be able to hear that it was still on the earth, brought excitement to me. When I first moved here, my heart was set on, I will not do polygamy. I will not do it. I was dead set against it, and I was like, I won't do it. Well, then I was sat at Angela Colley's table, and she started talking about the law of Sarah and how to kind of intertwine the polygamy with the Sarah's law. That kind of goes together. And that's what kind of really got me to it. And so after talking with her, I really prayed about it. And I was like, okay, maybe this is everything just kind of came more to light. And I did do a lot, and I mean a lot of praying about it and being able to find that this was the right place. And so just knowing, and then I've talked with Brother Zitting a lot, and he's answered a lot of questions too. And I was like, okay, I think this is where my family needs to be. This is, I guess you can say, is home for my family. I am very happy with that decision. Very happy, for sure.
My name is Lucy Knudsen. I am born in Texas, raised in California, and I moved to Centennial Park to gather with the priesthood. I moved to Utah after a divorce. I moved back to Utah after getting divorced and was raising my daughter, who was about 3. You guys know people know her, it's Leslie, married to Clarence Wayman. And that's where I met Thomas. I was working in a restaurant. He was on a construction crew that came to do some work on that restaurant. And completely out of character for him, he figured out where I lived and came over to my house to talk to me. He explained to me the gospel in a way that made sense. It was logical, the Adam-God doctrine, the fact that as God is, man may become, as man is, God once was, as God is, man may become. Made a lot of sense to me. It was logical. It kind of gave a continuity to things that I had been wondering about for a long time. You just see the hand of God in your life there. You can't not credit Heavenly Father for that, because it was out of character for me, it was out of character for him. He's not the type to run around and just, start talking to strange women that he's never met before. He had a wife at the time. She asked me why I wouldn't date him, and I said, I don't date married men. And she says, it's okay. So I was like, these people are really weird. It was based on her saying it was okay that I decided that I would continue to research and learn and figure things out. I got an interview with J.M. Hammond at Brother Wayman's house out on the lawn one time. And he said something to the effect, once girls join this work, they don't stay single long. I got baptized, confirmed, and married all on the same day, one right after the other. So that was extremely true in my case. And we lived in Salt Lake for a while, and then we moved down here, and we've been here ever since. And I have no regrets. I can't imagine being anywhere else. I don't want to be anywhere else. I love the people. I love the area. I love being where the priesthood is.
My name is Irmgard Frida Cook. My maiden name was Bortitsky. I was born in 1938. It was just before the war. I couldn't stand it. My father died in that war. He was blown to pieces because he was a cannon operator. And he was just... After the war, we were starving. I couldn't see much of future in Germany. And everything is destroyed, And I told my mother I want to go and see grandfather in America. And she didn't like that. She wanted me to stay. So, well, doesn't matter, it's my life. I need to do what I feel like I needed to do. So I wrote my grandfather a letter, and a couple of months later I was here. I got baptized into the church, and I stayed there for almost 15 years. But what I experienced in that church is that they were changing so many things, especially the temple garments. I went through the temple several times, and now they don't even have to wear them. They just have to have the marks in the pockets, and that's it. And so how can you have confidence in the Lord if He constantly changes His ordinances and stuff, Gladys Hammond died in 1976. We went with them, and we went to that funeral, and I told my husband, I think this is the place we need to be taught the gospel in the right way. He didn't want to follow where I wanted to go, to the priesthood. If you believe in something, you should follow it and get the testimony of it. Centennial Park, I think that's where the priesthood is. And so we decided to move there. And that was the right thing we did. The Lord inspired me.
So my name is Stan Shep. I was born to a Catholic mother and a Lutheran father, raised Catholic. Found that there were a couple doctrines that I really disagreed with. The idea that the Pope could not do anything wrong, especially when my son was born. And when I realized that the Catholic God wouldn't allow this infant to go to heaven if it were to die, I realized that I really didn't like that God. And so I started looking for another God. And I'd looked through the scriptures, through the Bible, and studied and developed my feelings towards this being that I was looking for. And when the Mormon missionaries eventually came to my house to quote unquote teach me, they showed me their Book of Mormon that had the doctrines in that I was looking for. And so I was interested, and I studied Mormonism in depth for 3 months. That I got baptized and became active in the LDS Church. But I was on this studying kick and reading the Journal of Discourses, and I lived next door to anti-Mormons that gave me anti-Mormon literature that said that Joseph Smith had more than one wife, and Brigham Young taught that Adam was God. It had footnotes and references, and so I started to read and study the footnotes and references, and they were true. Next thing you knew, I was a fundamentalist, and the more I studied, the more of a fundamentalist I became. But I knew I was different. I knew that people in the church didn't believe all of the doctrines that I had studied and found to be true. And so I continued to look, and I realized that I really didn't belong in the LDS Church anymore. And so I was looking for a place to be with like-minded people. Life events eventually put me in contact with people from Centennial Park, and I decided that that's where I needed to be. Everything just fell into place for me. I moved into St. George and attended church and got baptized in Centennial. When I got here, the doctrines that I was looking for were being taught. Nothing was whitewashed, nothing was watered down. It was the fullness, and it was exactly what I was looking for.
My name is Erica Shep, and I was born in Chicago and raised in San Diego, California. I lived there for over 20 years. I grew up in a family of 6. I became a Christian when I was 18. I was living in St. George and working, and I had a month off of work, and I kept bumping into this guy who turned out to be Stan, and just seeing him all around town, and finally he introduced himself, and he was very upfront about his beliefs, and he started telling me his story about how he got here. I wasn't on the same kind of search that he was, and so we would have a lot of conversations about faith, and he taught me a lot of things, brought up a lot of questions in my own heart and in my own faith. And as I started asking them, found out where that lined up with what he had in his heart. Stan brought me out to a church meeting, and afterwards we had dinner with Harvey Dockstader's family. I was really, really nervous. I had really not any contact with people in plural families, and I didn't know what to expect. And I walked into their home and just saw just such a focus on family and love and just togetherness, and I was so struck by it. I was like, this is amazing that these people, there's just so much love here. That's what I felt, and that's what I wanted in my life. When I went back to San Diego, I had a strong feeling of homesickness in my heart for a place that I'd only visited once in my life, and ended up moving here less than a year later.
My name is Carla Burton. I came from Salt Lake City, Utah. I grew up in the church with a great family. I'm the youngest of 13. My dad was the bishop of our ward. I just really loved how I was raised because the background helped me to get the fullness of the gospel. With the line upon line learning, I think I got the basics in the right order, so it helped me to accept more. I was ready for it. It helped me understand it and study it. So I actually came to a point in my life where I wanted a change, and I needed a change, and I was looking for something, and I didn't quite know what it was. I worked at Mountain States Mortgage, where I met Joseph Knudsen, and I actually started questioning him And so he gave me some answers and told me what books to go read so that I was able to research it and pray about it and learn for me why we should still be living this way and the things that the church had left out. So I wanted to learn that and change my life so I could have those blessings that I wasn't getting. My family did try to save me, sent me on some trips. They did have set up a whole meeting for me with the state president to try to teach me how it was wrong to live it today. But they know so little about it. I knew more than them because I've been researching it, and they couldn't refute anything I was saying, so that wasn't a deterrent to me at all. Actually proved to me that I understood and knew what I was doing was right. Basically, I was rejected by my family, so I had to make new friends. It was hard on my family. They come to terms with a lot of it. Well, they actually speak to me again, but they will never agree with. That's hard, but the blessings far outweigh any of that, so it's worth it to me. I moved here because I had accepted the fullness of the gospel. It's a great community. I love the spirit there. I love the people there. Everybody welcomed me in. In living the gospel, I was able to have the opportunity to live loyal marriage, and the fruits of this provided me the great environment to raise children and perfect my character.
My name is Patricia Wilcox Timpson. I am from Salt Lake City, Utah, and I am here because Heavenly Father gave me a reason to look for more truth than I had. My family is LDS, they're in the church, so I grew up in the church. So I worked in Brother Newton's mortgage company. This office down here does not put everything in their file, so we were constantly having to call. And so I talked to Lauren, and after I got the stuff he sent me, he says, now you owe me, now you need to send me flowers. So I made some candy flowers and sent them down, and it went from there, talking, and until I found out that he did believe in polygamy, and then my goal was to convert him to the church. After I found out that he did believe in polygamy, I went through the scriptures trying to find anything that said, don't do polygamy, this is not right. And started coming down here a little bit and just gained a little bit more knowledge, going to meetings and having the desire to actually know more of the truth myself. Just had to pray. I had to pray for the right thing, not to convert Lauren to the church, but for whoever needed to have information, that they would open their minds and have information. Then the light flicked on in my brain, so we got married in '94. I felt right at home. I felt like I belonged.
My name is Kevin LeBaron, and I was born in Mexico, lived down in the jungles, and my wife wanted to come back to her roots and join the work, and she did, even before we moved here. And that brought some fear into me that I would lose her. So part of the big aha moment was the fact that I did not have to be a member of the work to be able to keep my family, and the work and the priesthood were not out to split anything that way. So I was given all the time I needed, and I was exposed to the priesthood. They treated me very well compared to the way I had been raised to believe that they would treat an outsider. And so that was the first clue that I hadn't been always told the truth about the priesthood. And then as it evolved, and it took me a couple of years to wrap my head around it and to really get converted, then I just fell in love with it. Fell in love with the work, with the opportunities I have for my salvation, and the sustainability and the long-term plan that the priesthood offered, and that should be offered by the gospel. If it doesn't have that, then there's something missing in the gospel. When I finally asked for baptism and was given the priesthood, it fit so natural. Everything was so so at ease, so good that I never looked back. It worked well for me.
Okay, my name is Linda Earl Knudsen. I moved down here in 1980. I was born and raised in Layton, Utah. My parents were very active in the church. I was very active in the church. Always had some doubts about several issues of the doctrine. And when I was introduced to Joseph, he then introduced me to Brother Alm A. Timpson, and he walked me through a lot of the points about celestial marriage and why it was important to live it today, and where the priesthood really was. I'd done a lot of research, I'd done a lot of reading, and contrary to my parents' wishes, I met with Brother Musser on January 21st of 1980. After our meeting, we talked a little bit about baptism, and he told me that I could be baptized the next day on January 22nd. And at the end of that discussion, he then said, and after that, if you would like to join me back here, I will marry you and Joseph. You probably know that I have quite a few sister wives, and they are the biggest blessing to my life. I always find that there are areas that, I fall short in, that I have sister wives that have strengths in. I'm grateful for the opportunity that my children had to have more than one mom. I'm not saying it was always pretty for everyone. It's a lot of hard work, and it takes a lot of time, effort, and patience, but I wouldn't be in any other household, and I wouldn't want to live with any other people than what I live with. They're wonderful, they're kind and good and gracious to me, and we have a bond that's hard to break.
My name is Maylin Roberts, and I'm from Costa Rica. I was pregnant with Sarah in 2000. She was born in 2006. And when she was born, I was telling him that I want to raise my kids in a church. But I was a Catholic church, so he told me that the only church that he will go, it was the Mormon church, because he was raised in the Mormon church. And I think we got sealed in the temple in 2008. We stayed there for 3 or 4 more years after that, and then we decided to move here to raise the kid in the Mormon area. So it was really hard in the beginning for me, not for him, because he was looking for more knowledge. And but he's been teaching me, and I think it's the right place, because I see the difference in my kids, and it's the place that I want to raise my kids. Last year, it was when I decided I want to join the work. I've been hearing in the church, like in the meeting, that people want to change everything. The young people want to start changing. And I don't know why they want to do that. I think you guys have everything that you guys need in there. And it's not smart changing stuff and lowering their standards and everything. I think you guys have great things in there, and they should be happy. They don't have to change nothing, because that's what happened in the Mormon church. And that's why they're changing everything. That's one of the reasons too that I love living in there, because we have standards. We have to keep everything. We have to believe in everything, and that's it. It's a big thing. They can go and see everything outside, but it's not the same. It's crazy. I don't want my kids living in there. I don't want them doing things that they don't have to do it, and seeing things that they don't have to see. Here is being safe. It's good. I like it. I like all the practices and everything. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, my name is Jocko Roberts, and we actually came here from Costa Rica. We converted to the gospel, or actually we were introduced to the gospel and really to the Book of Mormon, and we gained a testimony of the mission and life of Joseph Smith in Costa Rica. And when we were there, we felt compelled we needed to leave. The concentration, the gathering of the saints is an important principle. And I think it's one of the main principles that's been lost, along with, of course, the fullness of celestial marriage and the united order and things of that nature. After studying and seeing, different differences between the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all of the associates of the prophet Joseph Smith, and in reading the scriptures, I came to the conclusion that the Gospel of James E. Talmage is probably the doctrines of men. I was delivering water into Masada School, and as I was delivering water one day, I just thought, boy, it'd be a wonder if my kids could be here. And it hit me. An impression of the Spirit so strong, I had to sit down. And in real terms, this was the first time I'd felt the impression of the Spirit for years. The first meeting I really had, I met with Brother Cowley. And it was a very good meeting. In the process of moving into Centennial Park, I started studying quite a bit. And I went to my priesthood leaders in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I asked very, very direct questions. And I never got an answer. They couldn't answer. No one could answer any of my questions. And they were basic questions about the gospel. In my meeting with Brother Cowley, I asked questions that were very direct. And the answers were plain and simple. And they were true. Here in Centennial Park, we found that the community in general is trying to maintain the standards necessary to live the fullness of the gospel.
Walter Dixon, South Carolina. I was born of a Mormon father. My mother had no interest in the religion, just in my father. I was under adversity, not persecution, but environmental situation. Now the folks there were the opposite of priesthood people, even though they have an excellent veneer of hospitality and graciousness. Folks where I moved to seemed cold by comparison, but the South Carolina folks are not priesthood type people in their culture. And I was practically on fire to get to Salt Lake because I was the headquarters of things. As soon as I got a high school diploma, I went to Salt Lake. I was oriented toward the priesthood. My wife was not oriented toward even the church. She thought she was a church girl, and her name was on the church. And so we were talking about the folks. There was something in the paper about Colorado City, and she was telling me those people are in adultery. They don't have any marriage. And I simply said their marriage is as good as your marriage is. And she was married in the Salt Lake Temple. I found the first 6 volume of the General Discourses in a bookstore in Salt Lake. I think the All Red folks published them. And after going into those, I went back to the bookseller. I said, where can I get the whole set? He said, Guy Musser, Truth Publishing Company. He gave me the number. I was 18 when I arrived in Salt Lake. I was 31 when I became acquainted with President Guy Musser. I was in Salt Lake, associated with the priesthood, and President Elman Timpson, after he'd become president of the priesthood, instructed all the Salt Lake people to move to Centennial Park, and that was what moved me. Oh, I feel wonderful about moving down. I'm in paradise.